Racist judge thinks she's just another black teenager. With attitude. Until she reveals she's a licensed attorney. Investigating him. The courtroom has its own rhythm, the noise of papers being shuffled, the occasional cough, and the dull whisper of the attorneys. Last-minute strategic exchanges, but today there's something different in the air, the attention is so dense. It feels like the walls themselves are leaning in, waiting to see what will unfold. In the center of it all, Judge Raymond Lancaster sits high in his chair, his presence like an old, unshakable oak. His reputation is carved into the wood. Just as it was, into the lives of those who stand before him, he's a man of predictable, unwavering habits. And though he'll never admit it, he likes things a certain way. That's why. When 19-year-old Amira Daniels stepped before him, wearing old jeans and a simple blouse, he barely looked up from the case file. Another black woman, he thought, wasting the courtroom's time. He'd seen this 100 times before. His fingers tapped idly on the bench as he adjusted his glasses. Miss Daniel drooled, stretching her name like an inconvenience. I see it says you were arrested for obstructing a police officer and resisting arrest. A direct violation. He waved a dismissive hand at the prosecutor, who barely paid attention. The fact that the charges were true didn't matter. There were chuckles from the audience as he dismissed her. Her arresting officers stood near the door, arms crossed in smug looks. But then Amira Daniels raised her head, her eyes shining with confidence. Her voice rang out clearly and calmly, "Judge Lancaster, I am not here as a defendant. I am representing myself as an attorney, and I am fully licensed." The room suddenly fell silent. Surprise was evident on everyone's faces. Judge Lancaster raised his head to look directly at her for the first time, and his eyes flashed with surprise. The tension was so intense that all eyes were on her. And, Amira continued, her voice unwavering, "I have some questions about the conduct of the officers who arrested me. I believe that there was a serious violation of my civil rights in this case." The tone of the courtroom changed completely. And this time, it was Judge Lancaster who had to listen. Prosecutor Richard Calloway didn't even look up from his notes. Amira stood silently, listening, unfazed. Judge Lancaster cocked his head in anticipation, and when she didn't respond immediately, his lips curled into something between impatience and amusement. "Miss Daniels, do you think this is a joke?" Finally, the judge's voice rang out, cold and sharp. "No, sir," Amira replied, her voice even. "Then I suggest you show this court some respect and take responsibility for your actions. Perhaps if you had paid more attention in school, you wouldn't be standing here today." That condescending remark changed the atmosphere in the courtroom. A thick silence spread, slow and heavy. The chuckles died away. Even Prosecutor Calloway looked up from his notes. But Amira remained unfazed. She took a deep breath, then slowly reached into her pocket. The bailiff standing nearby took an involuntary step forward, as if preparing to intervene. Judge Lancaster rolled his eyes, clearly preparing to dismiss whatever defense the young woman was about to offer. But then Amira pulled out a small black leather case and placed it on the defense table. When she opened it, the room froze. Inside was a shiny, carefully polished card, a document that only a licensed attorney could possess. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Judge Lancaster was stunned, Prosecutor Calloway frowned, and the bailiffs stood frozen. Amira gently placed the card on the table, tapping it with a finger. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and calm. "I paid a lot of attention in school. I graduated from law school at 18, passed the bar exam on my first try, and now work undercover for a legal watchdog organization." 3 seconds of dead silence filled the room before anyone could respond. Before the whispers could spread through the crowd, Judge Lancaster's smirk was lost in his own thoughts. Prosecutor Calloway sat up straight, flipping through the files frantically, as if the answer were hidden somewhere between the pages. The officers near the door glanced at each other, realizing the game had changed, but Lancaster was not ready to lose. The silence stretched on, the kind that made people shift in their seats, their own discomfort filling the space where words should have been. Even the air felt heavy, as if waiting for something to explode. Judge Lancaster blinked, trying to keep up with what he had just witnessed. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, his gaze lingering on the payment card on the table, as if staring long enough would make it disappear. But it didn't. The murmuring in the courtroom rose, then quickly turned into curious whispers. Who is she? Is this true? Prosecutor Calloway continued to flip through the papers, her eyes straining as she scanned each line of notes as if hoping to find an explanation. A mirror stood over every movement. She did not gloat, did not smile, did not wait for applause. She just patiently watched the judge, as if waiting for him to catch up with reality. Lancaster had never considered the possibility. He cleared his throat, forcing the sound back into his throat. That's ridiculous, he scoffed, but the sound was weak and hollow. A hoax, a lie. Impossible. He turned to Calloway. Is there any record of this woman being a member of the bar? Calloway hesitated. I don't know, sir. His fingers flew frantically over the keyboard, his face paling visibly. Lancaster turned back to the woman before him. His irritation was intense. So what do you think this changes? You're still obstructing an arrest. The woman tilted her head, her voice coming out like a hammer blow. Me? She slowly reached into her pocket, each movement deliberate as if daring anyone to stop her. She pulled out a slim file and placed it on the table with a sweeping motion. Your Honor, she began, her voice calm but confident, this is the audio from the body camera of the police officers who arrested me. Amira looked up, her eyes sharp. It shows that I asked only one question, what is my level of involvement? There was no threat, no obstruction, just a question. She pushed the file toward the bailiff. The bailiff hesitated, then picked it up and handed it to Lancaster. The judge snatched the file, flipped it open, and skimmed the first few lines. His jaw tightened. Amira continued, her voice unwavering. The Supreme Court has ruled that mere speech does not constitute obstruction unless it directly interferes with the actions of law enforcement. Asking questions is not a crime. Lancaster's fingers dug into the edge of the file. This is not for you to decide, he said, his voice low and angry. She returned his stare with surprising calm. It has already been decided, she said. Houston v. Hill, 1987. The Supreme Court affirmed the right of citizens to verbally challenge police without fear of arrest. If you wish, I can cite many other cases where officers have been found to have illegally detained civilians. A wave of whispers rippled through the courtroom. Everyone sat up straight, their eyes on the young woman who was slowly dismantling the judge's authority before their eyes. Lancaster's face darkened. He turned to Calloway, who was still staring at the screen, typing furiously. Yes, Calloway cleared his throat, his voice strained. Your Honor, she is a licensed attorney. I have checked her credentials. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. A reporter in the back row reached for his phone. A judge's face flashed with surprise before he caught himself. But Lancaster refused to let the situation slip away. His pride and power were hanging by a thread. Judge Lancaster sat high in his chair, his cold gaze sweeping the courtroom. And what do you expect me to do? Dismiss your case because you think you're smarter than me? His voice rose, like a knife cutting through the heavy air. Amira didn't flinch. Your Honor, I expect you to dismiss my case because the law requires you to do so. The words, though soft, carried the weight of truth, a blow to the ribs. She stepped closer, placing her hands on the polished wooden top of the defense attorney's desk. Her voice dropped, forcing the courtroom to bend down to listen. And while we're here, Your Honor, she continued, each word deliberately emphasized, we should also address another matter. She let the silence stretch just long enough to build tension. "I've reviewed your transcript of previous rulings. A disturbing pattern has emerged." The courtroom fell into a cold silence. Amira reached into her pocket, withdrew a thick stack of papers, and placed them on the table with a soft but resonant thud. "Would you like to discuss the statistical analysis of your sentencing discrepancies?" Judge Lancaster's demeanor changed instantly. But it wasn't just him, the entire courtroom sensed the storm brewing. The stack of papers remained on the table, but their very presence was enough to make Lancaster shift in his chair. His eyes flicked over the pages and then back to Amira, as if considering whether acknowledging their existence made them true. He didn't want to read them. He already knew what they contained. The problem was that Amira knew, too. "Please continue," Lancaster said, his voice lower, more careful. "Over the past 10 years, Amira said, her voice calm and methodical, your sentencing record has shown a consistent pattern." She paused, letting her words hang in the air. "For defendants charged with similar acts, blacks often receive harsher sentences. In some cases, they receive double the recommended sentence." The room was no longer a courtroom, it had become a battlefield where truth was told and justice was demanded. And Amira, with her strong voice and undeniable evidence, was at the forefront. A wave of anxiety rippled through the courtroom. A reporter was taking notes in a rush. Calloway, the prosecutor, sat motionless, his face pale, as if he wanted to melt into his chair. Lancaster took a sharp breath, his eyes flickering with anxiety. His patient, dressed in a thin suit, sat huddled, but this was completely unrelated to today's hearing. "That is if you intend to fight me," Amira said, her voice calm but sharp. A mirror seemed to reflect the tension. "Because that would make this another example in your growing list of discriminatory rulings." For the first time since the trial began, the judge did not react immediately. The silence stretched, broken only when Amira reached out and pulled the thick file closer to her. She flipped it open, her eyes landing on the first page. "Let's start with a case from 5 years ago," she said, pulling out a page. "A white college student, arrested for disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. He denied the charges, citing youthful indiscretion." The courtroom was silent. Amira turned to the next page. "A black high school student, same charges, same circumstances. But you sentenced him to 60 days in the county jail." The air grew more tense. Lancaster gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. Amira continued. "Here's another white defendant, first-time marijuana possession. You ordered him to probation. And here," she held up another sheet of paper. "The defendant is black, same charge, also a first offense. But you sentenced him to 3 years. Enough." Lancaster roared, his voice shaking. "This is not my trial." "No," Amira replied, her voice calm but sharp. "But perhaps it should be." A murmur rose in the courtroom. Someone in the back blew a low whistle. Even the usually stoic bailiffs looked nervous. Amira leaned forward, her voice quiet but full of weight. "I am not the first to notice your pattern, Judge. The civil rights organization has collected enough data to prove it." For years, that figure had remained. Judge Lancaster, the symbol of power and stability, had sat on the high bench, the gavel of justice in his hand, unwavering. But now, everything was about to change. What had they found? An undeniable truth. Lancaster's courtroom had one of the widest racial sentencing disparities in the state. It was not a mere accusation, it was the truth. And the truth echoed throughout the room. Judge Lancaster's hand hovered over the gavel, but he dared not strike it. He knew it was true. The air in the room tilted, every word he spoke shifted the balance of power. Amira Daniels stood there, eyes bright and voice steady. She pulled out a final piece of paper and held it aloft. "This is a formal complaint," she announced. It was filed with the Judicial Conduct Board last month. She let the words sink into the heavy silence before continuing. Many lawyers have accused you of bias in your rulings, Judge Lancaster. And guess what? My case has been flagged as part of that investigation. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Lancaster's face. He understood what that meant: an official investigation, public scrutiny. And if enough cases were found to have been ruled unfairly, he could lose everything. In the back of the room, reporters stopped taking notes. They were just watching a man who had been firmly in power for decades, for the first time, wiggle. The courtroom no longer belonged to Lancaster. It belonged to Amira Daniels. And the whole country was about to know it. But Amira wasn't finished yet. Judge Lancaster gripped the gavel, her knuckles white from the pressure. The air was heavy with anticipation. He could feel everyone's eyes on him. He cleared his throat, but his hoarse voice betrayed his rising anxiety. "This is a courtroom, not a media stage," he said, trying to maintain what little authority he had left. "You have no authority here, Amira Daniels. You are the defendant, I am the judge." Amira raised an eyebrow. "Isn't that right?" The question hit like a slap. The courtroom fell silent in gasps. Even the policemen on guard stirred. The power struggle had only just begun. Lancaster's mouth pressed into a thin line, his eyes hard and intimidating. But Amira was not the type to be silenced. "Your Honor," she said, her voice slow and deliberate, but each word carried weight. "A judge's authority comes from the law, not from the bench. And the law says you must be fair." She took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "The Code of Judicial Conduct requires that a judge act at all times in a manner that promotes public confidence in the integrity and impartiality of the judiciary." She paused, letting the words sink into the tense air. "But your history tells a different story." Lancaster slammed the gavel down, the sound sharp. "You're getting off track," he growled. Amira was unfazed. "You can hit that gavel as many times as you like," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But that won't change the facts." She turned slightly, her eyes sweeping the reporters behind her. "I wonder how the public would feel knowing that a sitting judge has been deliberately discriminatory in his rulings for decades." Lancaster's chest heaved, his breathing uneven for the first time. Where the power had once made him invincible, he now looked small. Calloway, the prosecutor, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly aware that he was on the wrong side of history. He glanced at Lancaster and then at the documents scattered on the table. But Amira wasn't just exposing a biased judge, she was forcing the system to answer for itself. And she didn't stop there. "Your Honor," she continued, her voice razor sharp, "I have filed a motion to dismiss my case immediately on grounds of judicial misconduct." A gasp rippled through the room. Lancaster's jaw clenched, his power was waning, and he knew it. "You can't," he began, but Amira turned to Calloway. "Mr. Calloway," she said smoothly, her sharp gaze locking with the prosecutor, "as prosecutor, you have the power to dismiss these charges right now." Calloway's face paled, his hands tightening around the documents. For a moment, the courtroom fell silent, but no one doubted who was in control. The figure remained motionless, but the evidence was clear. The cameras were still rolling, and public perception was changing before his eyes. If he chose to continue defending this, he would not only be seen as complicit, but as an active participant in the corrupt system. He hesitated for a moment, then exhaled deeply, his eyes turning to the judge. The prosecution abruptly withdrew all charges. "Your Honor," the attorney said, and the room exploded with gasps and murmurs. The sound of keyboards was frantic as reporters rushed to record this historic moment. Lancaster's face was pale, as if all the blood had left him. Behind him, Amira tilted her head slightly, a fleeting smile of meaning. "It seems the law has finally caught up with you," she said, her voice soft but steely. The judge's gavel hung in the air, but his power was now purely ceremonial. There was nothing he could do, he had lost. But Amira was not finished. A heavy silence fell over the room, as if the weight of the truth were falling on Lancaster. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His once absolute power had evaporated in an instant. The prosecution, who had stood by him, had turned away. The courtroom, once Lancaster's sacred domain, had become a public stage for the world to witness his downfall. Reporters typed furiously, their fingers flying over keyboards, recording every detail. Court staff exchanged puzzled glances, unsure whether they were watching a legitimate trial or the public humiliation of a man who had once held absolute power. Judge Lancaster's face was flushed, his hands gripping the edge of his chair, his knuckles white from the tight grip. He was not used to losing, but this was more than just a loss, it was an exposure. Amira turned to the crowd, her voice calm and clear. For years, men like Judge Lancaster have hidden behind their robes, believing themselves untouchable. But today, the system he upholds is being forced to answer. A man in the gallery let out a lone clap, but it was quickly followed by another. Soon the entire courtroom erupted in resounding applause, loud and decisive. Lancaster looked around, his gaze scanning the crowd, but found no allies in the sea of people watching his downfall. Amira stood in the center of the courtroom, her eyes blazing with determination. Before her, Judge Lancaster sat motionless in his chair, his mask of arrogance cracking, revealing the panic that lurked in every movement. "Your Honor," Amira said, her voice cold but clear. "Before I leave this courtroom, I want to remind you of something." She took a step forward, her eyes never leaving him. "The judicial complaint against you has been expanded, based on the evidence I presented today." She gestured to the thick stack of documents on the table. "It will be formally filed as part of the ongoing investigation." Lancaster's jaw clenched, his face pale. He knew exactly what that meant: Ethics Review Board, formal hearing, possible disbarment. Beside him, Calloway bowed his head, rubbing his hands over his face, clearly trying to process the fallout in real time. And the most obvious, he had no intention of going down with Lancaster. Lancaster took a deep breath, trying to regain control. But when he opened his mouth, the trembling of his voice only made the gnawing fear more apparent. Amira didn't let him finish. "Sir," she interrupted, her voice steady and sharp. "You've spent decades ensuring that people accused, especially people of color, receive the harshest punishments. You've robbed them of futures, torn their families apart, and played God with their lives." Lancaster's nostrils flared, his face contorted with anger and fear. "And now," Amira continued, her voice low, barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of undeniable truth. "The person on trial is you." The room exploded. Whispers, the clicking of cameras. The courtroom doors swung open, and two uniformed officers entered. They were representatives of the State Commission on Judicial Conduct. Lancaster's face paled as one of the officers stepped forward, his voice echoing through the chaos. "Judge Lancaster, you are under investigation for multiple judicial complaints. You will be suspended immediately pending further review." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Reporters leaped to their feet, cameras flashed incessantly. And through it all, Lancaster's silence was the loudest, as he sat there, stripped of all power, his mask of arrogance now a relic of fear. The auditorium erupted. Cheers, gasps, and whispers mingled in a surging wave of sound. Lancaster stood on the witness stand, blood dripping from the wound on his forehead, running in long streaks down his pale face. He was no longer the symbol of absolute power, only a defeated, confused, and frightened man. Amira watched everything from the back row, watching everything quietly. Her expression remained as calm, as unreadable as the surface of a still lake. But as she stood up, slung her bag over her shoulder, and headed for the exit, the corners of her lips lifted into a small smile, a smile of triumph. Justice had finally knocked, but this was not the end. This was only the beginning of a new chapter. The sound in the courtroom spread like waves crashing on the shore. Overlapping conversations, reporters shouting orders to their photographers, the murmurs of Lancaster's former legal staff, now speaking to each other in shocked tones, as if reality had just shattered. Lancaster remained motionless. The gavel, once the symbol of absolute power, was now useless in his hands. His eyes swept over the court officials flanking the podium, their presence a clear sign that his time was up. Amira watched the scene with cold equanimity. She knew the fight wasn't over, there was still a long way to go. But this moment was the first real consequence of Lancaster's years of abuse, of destroying lives in the name of justice. Lancaster's voice finally rose, but it was weaker and more shaky than ever. "This is a mistake," he muttered, but no one listened. "I have served this court faithfully for 30 years, he tried to defend himself. "This is a witch hunt." A dry laugh rang out from the crowd, and then a female voice spoke up, strong, unflinching. "Tell that to my brother," she said loudly. "He is serving 10 years for the same crime you let go, just because the victim was a white college student." A murmur of agreement spread. Other voices began to rise, emboldened by Lancaster's fall. The moment was no longer just a trial, it was a movement. Amira walked slowly toward Calloway. The prosecutor was clearly still shaken, his eyes reflecting shock, as if he had just witnessed the unthinkable. Calloway had been closely allied with Lancaster all these years. But now the ship was sinking, and he knew he had to find a way out. Amira stopped in front of Calloway, her eyes sharp but her voice soft as a knife. "I have won the case now. I want to ask you something." Calloway swallowed hard. She tilted her head a little, her eyes sharp as she watched him shift in his seat. "How many cases like mine have you prosecuted under this judge?" The question hit him like a punch to the gut. Calloway blinked in surprise. He started to answer but then stopped, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I'll tell you how many," Amira continued, her voice calm but heavy. The silence stretched, deafening. She held his gaze, waiting. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Calloway took a deep breath. He hesitated again, but this time, his voice was heavy. "That's unprecedented," he said at last. "I will cooperate with the investigation." A collective gasp filled the room. Lancaster's head jerked up. "You can't be serious, Calloway." The prosecutor didn't look at him. His eyes remained fixed on the mirror. "I am part of the system," he admitted. "But I will no longer protect it." Amira watched him. She had seen men like him before, comfortable in their complicity, protected by the system. But there was something about this moment that made it all real. Perhaps for the first time in his career, Calloway saw cracks in the foundations of the system he had upheld. Or perhaps he simply knew that he did not want to go down with Lancaster. Either way, it didn't matter. "Then let's get to work," Amira said simply. She turned back to the judge. Lancaster's breathing was shallow now. His face was grim, still fighting to regain control, still clinging to the last shreds of power he thought he had. But that power was gone. One of the court officials stepped forward. "Sir," he said, his voice calm but firm, "you will need to come with us." For the first time, Judge Raymond Lancaster had been ordered to leave his own courtroom. And this time, he had no choice but to comply. As Amira stepped out of the building, the afternoon sun gently fell on her shoulders. Cameras followed her every step, every glance. Amira kept her composure, despite the media storm that surrounded her. Beside her, her escort assistant walked quickly, protecting her from the screams and bright flashes. Amira bent down to pick up her pile of documents that had fallen earlier and slung her bag over her shoulder. In the midst of all the noise, her confidence was the only thing that kept her calm. News sites exploded within minutes of the verdict being announced. Young lawyer shakes justice system, judge suspended after chaotic trial, Amira Daniels exposes bias in courtroom. Those headlines flooded social media and newspaper front pages. But Amira knew, this wasn't just about her. This was about justice, about a system that needed fixing. As she stepped down the court steps, a crowd of reporters immediately jostled her, microphones and cameras aimed like weapons at her. The questions came like machine guns. Did you expect this outcome, Ms. Daniels? How long have you been investigating Judge Lancaster? What do you say about the accusations that you rigged this? Amira raised her hand, not loudly but enough to silence the crowd. I rigged nothing, she said, her voice steady and sharp. I was just doing what the law allows any citizen to do, challenge injustice. Flashbulbs flashed, illuminating her face, but Amira did not flinch. She was not here for fame, nor recognition. She was here for justice. Out of the corner of her eye, Amira saw a woman standing apart from the crowd. She had her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes a mixture of skepticism and cautious admiration. Amira recognized her immediately, Lena Warren, the older sister of a high school student who had been unjustly convicted under Judge Lancaster. While another student, a white student, had been set free. Their eyes met. Without words, both understood that this was just the beginning. Lena nodded once, a small but powerful acknowledgement. Amira nodded back. This wasn't just one case. This was about hundreds of people. People who had been railroaded by a system that was never meant to serve them. People like Lena's brother. And now that system was cracking under its own weight. A sharp beat pulled her attention back to reality. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. She stepped away from the camera, pulling it out to see the flood of messages. Some were from friends, some from lawyers. Some she'd never met thanking her. But one message stood out. Unknown number, we should talk. I have something you want to see. Her breath caught. She stared at the screen for a second, before glancing back at the courthouse. This wasn't over. Not even close. With one last glance at the reporters, she turned on her heel and walked away. Because what happened next was going to be even bigger.